Oh, I got a few people. I'll start, and hopefully people will show up. So yeah, so what I've been doing is going over the questions, and these are all the ones that you're going to see are the published questions and answers, and this is just the correct answers. And so I'm going to go over each of them, unless folks know them, they make sense. I'll explain what they are, and just so they make a little bit more sense when you answer the question and whatnot. So, but of course, you know, a lot of this is still going to be memorization. So we were over here on the definition of a beacon, and so a beacon is an amateur station that transmits communication for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. And what these actually do is they are stations that transmit on a certain frequency all the time, and you can actually tune into them and figure out if you can hear them or not. If you can hear them, then you actually have a chance of going out a certain frequency. So for example, this is, let me find the, that is what a beacon might sound like. That happens to be one I got in my garage. But that is something so you can actually tune in and figure out if you can hear certain things on certain bands. So if you remember when we're talking about amateur radio bands, they change from day to day. And so sometimes you need to figure out if you can hear them or not, and that's one way is a beacon. So that's explanation of that. This is a memorization one, which is, was the FCC Part 97 definition of a space station? An amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And that's just the definition. You just have to remember it's 50. I don't know what the other questions are. I think the other ones are different numbers, but 50 is the one. And I think that's actually the edge of space. So on the next question, which is, which of the following entities recommends transmit, receives channels, and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? And actually, this is for any frequencies. It's all voluntary. And so here, there's a volunteer frequency coordinator who's recognized by local amateurs, which recommends this. And who selects that frequency coordinator? Amateur radio operators do in that local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeater or auxiliary stations. So the people who have repeaters in a particular location all get together and coordinate frequencies. So it's all volunteer, but everyone agrees, and there's a coordination group, usually an organization, which everyone agrees to follow. So which of the following describes the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, or RACES? And it's actually all of these, which is a radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense, radio service using amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense communications, an emergency service using amateur operators certified by a civil defense organization as being enrolled in that organization. Blah, 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 blah. All those are correct. So it's basically amateur radio for civil defense is RACES. Some background to this is all this came about, I believe, during the Cold War, when people were afraid of nuclear war and all that. And this was kind of a part of the whole, if you needed to communicate with people, you'd have this. So that is what RACES is.
Hey, Ben, question. So in the test, answering any of those is correct, or you have to answer
it's going to be all the choices. It's going to be the last one. Yeah. Okay, so when is willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted? At no time. So this is something that's interesting, that's different between amateur radio and other frequencies. So if anyone's ever been used CB radios, there's a lot of people who will interrupt each other and talk over each other and all that. And there's no actual control over the FRS and GMRS. Amateur radio, you're not supposed to interfere with anyone else. And you'll notice it's very, very different than most other radio. It's very, very courteous. You got to ask if the frequency is in use. You try not to get in the way of other folks, for the most part. So, okay, so these are questions.
For those of us with very small screens, could you repeat the question, like at the beginning, at the end, or a couple of times, so that we can keep
Sure, I can do that. Do you want me to make it bigger? I can make it bigger.
That'd be great. But that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, does that help too?
Yes, that makes a difference.
Okay, great. So actually, I can kill that window there. So there's a whole section that are about FCC rules, descriptions, and definitions of amateur radio, and these questions are all memorization questions. They're just, you know, all the laws and the rules and whatever. So which of the following is a purpose of the amateur radio service as stated in the FCC rules and regulations? Advancing skills in technical and communication phases of the radio art. So you'll remember the presentation, you know, the purpose of amateur radio. There's a number of them, but one of them is advancing the technical and communication phases of radio art, so developing new radio technology. And which agency regulates and enforces the rules? The FCC. And I think almost everyone will remember that one. And what are the rules regarding the phonetic alphabet? It's encouraged. I think we actually went over these, so let me make sure. Yes, we did. I'll go back over here. Okay. So another one here, which we didn't go over, is what is the International Telecommunications Union? And that is a United Nations agency for information and communication technology issues. So that is the you know, the international organization that handles all this. So that is the ITU. And yep. Okay. So which amateur radio stations may make contact with an amateur radio station on the International Space Station using 2-meter and 70-centimeter band frequencies? And that is what the license you guys are going to get, which is an amateur holding a technician or a higher class license. So as soon as you get your basic license, you can actually talk to the International Space Station. And it says 2-meter and 70 centimeters. So that's 2 meters and 70 centimeters. 70 centimeters is a 440 megahertz, and 2 meters is 146. And there's some math behind that, but in most cases, just got to, if you memorize them, it's a lot easier. Which frequency is within the 6-meter amateur band? 52.525 megahertz. There's only a few of these. Again, there's a formula going between megahertz and meters, and the easiest thing for me, and I'd recommend, is just memorize the answers to these. There's a math question, but you know, there's only so many. There's only a few of them, so and that's how everyone I know remembers them anyway. You don't ever do the math; you just kind of remember what the bands are. So, what amateur band are you using when your station is transmitting on 146.52 megahertz? The 2-meter band. So the one for anything in the 144, 140 to 148 is 2 meters. And that's going to be easier just to memorize. What is the limitation for emissions on frequencies between 219 and 220 megahertz? And this is another just memorization one. It's fixed digital message forwarding systems only. And that is these, between those two frequencies, you can only do digital messages. Okay, so on which HF bands does a technician class operator have phone privileges? So this is asking, can you have, can you talk with voice on what bands, HF bands? And there's only one band as a technician you can use, which is 10 meters. There's no other ones that you can use on phone. So all you have to do is remember that. And 10 meters when it's open is great, but it hasn't been open recently because of the sunspots. But anyway, this is the only band in HF as a technician that you're allowed to use on voice. So that's the reason why a lot of people say, hey, I'm going to upgrade from technician to general. So that's memorization one. Here it says, which of the following VHF, UHF frequency ranges are limited to CW only? So the magic trick on CW, which is Morse code, is anything below 0.1 megahertz on any band is CW only. So in this case, 50 to 50.1, 144 to 144.1. Just remember that below 0.1 on any band is Morse code. And that's the case for every band, not just these, but every band. Which of the following is a result of the fact that the amateur radio service is secondary in all or portions of some amateur bands, such as portions of the 70 centimeter band? And secondary means that we're not the only users in the band. And the key is that we are not allowed to, or we're supposed to avoid interfering with non-amateur stations in those portions of the band. The reason for this is the FCC sold off some pieces of the amateur radio band for use in various systems, and I don't remember which ones were. I think there's like some postal thing or delivery thing and that sort of thing. A lot of which were never used. I think land mobile radios or something like that was one of them. But anyway, if you find anyone in there, you have to avoid interfering with them. I have to say we never ever run into anyone on those bands. Aside from the folks who are not licensed, such as the Russians. The Russians will pound on bands with their radars. But anyway, so if you did happen to be someplace where they had secondary usage, you're supposed to avoid interfering with them. Okay. So the next question is, why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of the amateur band or subband? And all the choices are correct. And this is to allow for calibration error in the transmitter frequency display. This is because what's on the band may be off a little bit. So your equipment may not be exact. Here it says, so that the modulation sidebands do not extend beyond the band edge. And that's because every signal takes up a certain amount of space. And if you are on the edge of the band, sometimes you can drift over the edge. And here it says to allow for transmitter frequency drift, same kind of thing, is if your equipment is not exactly calibrated, you don't want to go beyond your limits. So this is why you don't exactly transmit at the edge of a band. And all those are correct. And some of these only make sense when you start operating, but this is something that these are some of the things that make sense as you start operating. Okay, which of the following HF bands have frequencies available to the technician class operator for RTTY and data transmissions? 10-meter band only. And again, the HF bands that you primarily have access to as a technician, there's only one, 10 meters. So just remember 10 meters for HF. Okay, what is the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using their assigned portion of the HF bands? And the answer is 200 watts, and that's just to remember that one. That is for HF, is 200 watts. The next one is, except for some specific restrictions, what is the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using frequencies above 30 megahertz? So that's like using microwave equipment, and it's 1500 watts. And that's just another one to remember again. So, okay, next section is all about operator licensing. And these are all rules that you just have to remember again. We went over most of these. First one is, for which license classes are new licenses currently available from the FCC? So historically, there have been a bunch of different license classes, and the only ones that are around now are technician, general, and amateur extra. There's some parts of the band that have other license classes marked, but you can't get those licenses anymore. So the ones you got to know are technician, general, and amateur extra. That's the pyramid that I showed earlier. Who may select a desired call sign under the vanity call sign rule? So vanity call signs are exactly like vanity license plates. And anybody who has any kind of amateur license can select it. So just so you know that. One of the friends of mine who is a former firefighter, his is K6 CPR for, like CPR. And people have their own other ones that are whatever they feel like they like. So if they're available. Okay. Next question is, what types of international communications is an FCC licensed amateur radio station permitted to make? And the answer is communications incidental to the purposes of the amateur radio service and remarks of a personal character. So the reason this question's there is because you cannot start up an FCC amateur radio station to replace the telephone, for example, or to to conduct business. So this is the rules are personal character comments, just about, hey, how's it going? How are things? Anything amateur radio related, but nothing else. Next question. When are you allowed to operate your amateur station in a foreign country? So as a radio amateur, you can operate an amateur radio station elsewhere only if the foreign country authorizes it. And there's usually some kind of procedure to go through. So if you decide to visit a foreign country, when you can actually get to a foreign country again, you need to make sure that that country lets you transmit. I'm gonna come back to this one, but real quick, from which of the following locations may an FCC licensed amateur radio station, amateur station transmit? From any vessel or craft located in international waters and documented or registered in the United States. So this is the other place you can transmit from. If you are in international waters, and that vessel is documented or registered in the United States, you can also use transmit, as long as the captain allows you. So let's go back one. Which of the following is a valid call sign for a technician class amateur radio station? K1XXX is the answer, and that's just a memorization one. I've got to go look and see what the other non-valid call signs are, but that is just remember the K1XXX one. Okay, next question, which is going to be cut off, is what may result when correspondence from the FCC is returned as undeliverable because the grantee failed to provide and maintain a correct mailing address with the FCC? Revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator license. So if the FCC tries to send you mail and they can't, then they will revoke your license. Now, I have to say that the FCC no longer sends mail to anybody who's an amateur, but if they wanted to, you got to have a valid address there. And they're trying to keep people from creating amateur radio licenses with fake addresses. That's what the main thing is. However, you can use a business address. So I've got mine to a PO box. What is the normal term for an FCC issued primary station operator radio license grant? 10 years. And you just got to remember it's 10 years. So you actually have to renew after 10 years. If you forget, there's a grace period. And what is the grace period following the expiration of an amateur license within which the license may be renewed? 2 years. So if you forget to renew for whatever reason, you have 2 years to get it renewed and keep your call sign. Otherwise, you have to take the tests again, and you have to go through the whole rigmarole. So remember that.
Ben,
Yes.
I have the other call signs for you if you want them from T1CO5.
Yeah, okay.
KA1X and W1XX.
Okay, yeah. So just remember the K1. So there are there's others that are special classes of call signs, and there are certain rules on how they work. So it's easier just to remember this one here. So okay, Great. So how soon after passing the examination for your first amateur radio license may you operate a transmitter on an amateur radio service frequency? And so the rule is as soon as it shows up in the database. So as soon as your operator station license grant appears in the FCC license database. So you don't need a piece of paper to come from the FCC. You don't need to do anything else. All you need to do is have it in the database. Next question. If your license has expired and is still within the allowable grace period, may you continue to operate a transmitter on amateur radio service frequencies? And the answer is no. Even if you can renew and you haven't yet, you can't transmit until it shows that the license has been renewed. So that is the rule there. And they just want you to know the rules. I have to tell you, during Hurricane Maria, it was a free-for-all. There, I was punching in call signs of people, and there were people who were way expired. Anyway, don't do that. Okay, so this next section is authorized and prohibited transmissions. And so the first question is, with which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communications? Basically, and here's the official text, is any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, that it objects to such communications. I'm not aware of any countries, but I suspect, you know, there's a few countries, you know, I'm thinking of North Korea, where they don't really want anyone to show up. And someone asked about the penalty for transmitting without a license. The first thing is no one's going to talk to you if you don't have a license. Amateur radio operators will not acknowledge someone who's not licensed. And the second thing is they'll hunt you down, and I don't know what the penalty is, but you don't want to be penalized. Okay. Under which of the following circumstances may an amateur radio station make one-way transmissions? And that's when transmitting code practice, information bulletins, or transmissions necessary to provide emergency communications. The reason this exists is because they do not want you to become a broadcaster. So you're not here to put your own talk show on. You're not here to put your own religious station on or start a music station. You cannot be a broadcaster. And this was specifically put out there. They will, yeah, you can do these, and the others you can't. Someone asked about how do people know if you're expired? Is because people look you up in the FCC database, and they know whether or not you're expired or not. And yeah, you don't want to be fined. And it is not in the spirit of amateur radio to try to get on without a proper rules. You have to remember that amateur radio is kind of the more respectable part of the radio bands. So, you know, CB radio guys will do whatever they want, and they'll swear. And ham radio, everyone follows the rules, or should, and it is much better. So anyway, when is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to hide their meaning? And the answer is only when transmitting control commands to a space station or radio control craft. So unfortunately, amateur radio doesn't allow you to do any kind of encryption. That includes on the digital and the internet-like speeds. You can't do that unless you're trying to control a space station, and that's because they don't want anyone to of course, send false commands to space station or radio-controlled craft. So no encryptions allowed. Under what conditions is an amateur radio station authorized to transmit music using a phone emission? So when can you play music on amateur radio? There's only one condition, believe it or not, and that is incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. So the reason why this exists is because somebody said we do not want amateur radio operators to be radio stations and play music tracks. So that is why this exists, is no music. Okay, when may amateur radio operators use their stations to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? And the answer is when that equipment is normally used in an amateur station and such activity is not conducted on a regular basis. So what they're saying here is that you can't run an amateur radio station just to sell equipment. If you normally use that in your amateur station and you don't do sales all the time, then you can sell your equipment on the air, but they don't want you to make it into a frequency where you're always selling your stuff. So that is that. What, if any, are restrictions concerning transmission of language that may be considered indecent or obscene? So can you use swear words on amateur radio? No. Any such language prohibited. And people are pretty good about that. Okay. What types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the stations of other amateur stations? These you'll just have to remember: repeaters, auxiliary, or space stations. And those are just the definitions of the stations that can automatically retransmit signals. In which question?
What's auxiliary?
So you can have a second station, for example, put it on top of a. There's one. If anyone knows, in Southern California, there's Topanga Canyon, which is near Malibu, and they actually have an auxiliary station so that when they're inside the canyon, they can get out of the canyon. And it is just another. It's like a repeater, except for it takes it actually takes signals and it transmits somewhere wherever it happens to be, but it's not a repeater. It's just another way of sending a signal. So and the space stations obviously are something in space, a satellite or the space station. Okay, in which of the following circumstances may the control operator, and that's the person who is controlling an amateur station, receive compensation for operating that station? And the only time you can do that is when the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. So you can't charge for running an amateur radio station. So you can't take money for manning a marathon or something like that. That's not allowed. So it's not it's an amateur radio station. It's not a professional radio station. Okay, under which of the following circumstances are amateur stations authorized to transmit signals related to broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? And the answer is only where such communication directly relate to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. So the reason they have this is they do not want news organizations to use amateur radio to transmit information for their broadcasts. The one exception here that they make is if you are communicating information directly related to immediate safety of human life or protection of property. So, for example, if there's a reporter who says, "Oh, we got to let people know that the fire is going to be in this and that location," that is allowed, but you can't use it to say, "Hey, we have a human interest story, blah, 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 blah." So that is the one. That's just, again, a memorization of the rules. What is the meaning of the term broadcasting in the FCC rules? And we already went over broadcasting, and it's transmission intended for reception by the general public. So broadcasting is when you're aiming at the public and not other amateurs. And the last question in this section is, when may an amateur station transmit without on-the-air identification? And that's when transmitting signals to control model craft. So usually when you're on an amateur radio, you have to identify what your call sign is. So and James mentions that yes, all your transmissions are generally considered public, though. Anyway, so when I think there's a question farther on, but when you talk on the radio, you actually have to transmit your call sign, and some of those, there's some questions here later about it, and so you generally end with your call sign. So mine being AI6YR, I will say something to somebody else and say, and this is AI6YR. So and drones are model aircraft, yes. Okay, so the next section is control operator and control types. This is all about who is controlling what. And these are all have legal reasons for being there. And so I won't go over that. When is an amateur radio station permitted to transmit without a control operator? And that is never. So you can't have your amateur radio transmit without somebody in control. And basically, people think of that as having somebody who's able to hit the off switch. Okay, who may be the control operator of a station communicating through an amateur satellite or space station? And this is a rule that just for covering a technicality, which is any amateur whose license privilege allows them to transmit on the satellite uplink frequency. And the reason why, and this is a little complicated, is that when you are transmitting to a satellite, the signal may come down on a different frequency. And it may be a frequency that's not, that you're not licensed for. So the rule is if you can transmit on the uplink frequency, it doesn't matter what the downlink frequency is. Okay, who must designate the station control operator? Legal, this has all got some legal definitions between it, and it's the station licensee. So the person who's licensed for the station must designate who's operating. So if someone comes over to your house, you have to give them permission to use your station. And there's, anyway, okay, move on there. And what determines the transmitting privileges of an amateur station? And the class of operator license held by the control operator. So if I let one of you guys use my radios, even though I'm extra and if I'm not here, but I let you use the station, you have to transmit only in your license. So that is what that is about. This is more legalese. What is an amateur station control point? The location at which the control operator function is performed. And that's just a memorization one. And next question is the same kind of area, is when, under normal circumstances, may a technician class licensee be the control operator of a station operating in an exclusive amateur extra class operator segment of the amateur bands? And the answer is at no time. So you can't be a technician and operate in amateur extra ever. So so this one is when the control operator is not the station licensee, who is responsible for the proper operation of the station? So if one of you guys gets licensed, comes over to my house, and I let you use my station, and you start violating rules and that sort of thing, it's both the control operator and the station licensee who are equally responsible. So this is kind of like if I let you use my car and you go run someone over. In the case of amateur radio, both you and the person who is driving are responsible, right? So that is kind of the idea. Which of the following is an example of automatic control? Repeaters are automatic. So that's just a definition you got to know. And the next one is all choices correct, is which of the following is true of remote control operation? And all of these are correct. The control operator must be at the control point. The control operator is required at all times. And the control operator indirectly manipulates the controls. And you just got to memorize that. But if there's a remote control station, you always have to have an operator, and it's considered that the control operator is at the control point. These are all just definitions. So, okay. And what is an example of remote control as defined in Part 97? Again, this is just a memorization rules. Operating the station over the internet is considered remote control. And you can actually run a amateur radio over the internet. And just to break things up, why don't I do that real quick if you guys are interested. Let me find that real quick. And I'll share that in a second as soon as it pops up. So you can actually run a amateur radio sitting from your desk and not be there. So let's I'm going to share this just for fun, and we will go as soon as I find the window. If I can find the window, 2 seconds here. Screen, screen, screen. There we go. Okay, does everyone see this? This is RC4 client.
Yes.
Okay, so this is one way of running an amateur radio where you don't actually have to have a radio. And this is a list of remote stations, what radio they are and where they are. So we can go anywhere and dial around if they let us. So, for example, if you want to hear what's going on in Florida, I know so this is amateur radio in Florida. And you can dial around, and I can actually transmit on this if I wanted to. And this is somewhere in Latin America. Okay, so that's a remote station. Okay, so let's go back to questions. Okay, so the next question is, who does the FCC presume to be the control operator of an amateur station unless documentation to the contrary is in the station records? And the answer is the station licensee. So I'm going to go back here. The reason this question exists is if you have, so the FCC sometimes will find that people are violating the rules, and the FCC will actually go and figure out where the signals are coming from, and they actually, you know, if you guys remember the movies where the where there's a white van with antennas on it, I got the FCC with the white vans with antennas on it actually figures out, hey, all these pirate radio or these illegal transmissions are coming from this house. And it turns out they go and knock on the door, and it's an amateur radio operator, and the operator says, hey, it's not me, but they can prove that the signals came from your house. Well, they assume that if your address is in the station records, and they assume that you're the control operator. So that is why that exists. Okay, so more rules. Station identification, we'll talk about this a little bit. So first of all, it says, when must the station licensee make the station and its records available for the FCC? And this one's anytime the FCC requests it. So back in the original, back before computers, a lot of, and it's not a requirement to do this, but most amateur radio operators keep a log of who they talk to, which is who did you contact, or who did you hear, and other information. And the rule is, if you've got those, the FCC can request it, and you have to provide it to them. Okay, next one is, when using tactical identification such as race headquarters during a community service net operation, how often must your station transmit the station's FCC assigned call sign? And if you ever listen to amateur radio operators when they're operating, the answer is at the end of each communication and every 10 minutes during the communication. So every time you transmit, you're supposed to identify, and every 10 minutes during communication. So the reason why sometimes people will use tactical identifiers, but they still want to know who's making the transmission. So if I'm running a amateur radio as race headquarters, I'll go, this is race headquarters. Could checkpoint 1 please call in? And I'll go, and this is AI6YR, right? So that's why. And every 10 minutes is, if you're talking for a long time, you need to put your call sign out every 10 minutes. So this is basically the same question. When is an amateur radio station required to transmit its assigned call sign? At least every 10 minutes during and at the end of a communication. So just rules to know. Which of the following is an acceptable language to use for station identification when operating in the phone subband? English. So people often ask me, what language do people use in amateur radio? Well, every amateur radio operator, even in foreign countries, has to put out their station identification in English. So that is the rule for on voice. And so you'll see that even if you're listening to two guys speaking in Russian, eventually they'll pull out their call sign in English. What is the method of call sign identification for a station transmitting, again, phone signals, and that's voice. And here it says send the call sign using CW or a phone emission. So you can also use Morse code if you wanted to. So Morse code is legal, or your call sign. Okay. Next one, all these are correct, and this is just a memorization thing. Which of the following formats of a self-assigned indicator is acceptable when identifying using a phone transmission? KL7, CC, stroke W3, slant W3, slash W3. So this is a Alaska call sign, by the way, KL7 is. And what this means, just so you know, is stroke W3 or slant W3 or slash W3 means they're operating in the W3 district. So if you remember the map, and this is just saying that you could use any of those. And just remember all. Okay, next one. Which of the following restrictions apply when a non-licensed person is allowed to speak to a foreign station using a station under the control of a technician class control operator? And the rule is the foreign station must be one with which the U.S. has a third-party agreement. So third-party traffic is somebody who is not licensed. And so the rule is you can't talk to other countries or transmit a message from someone who's not licensed unless they have a third-party agreement with that foreign country. And that's because some foreign countries say, hey, you cannot send messages to anyone or from anyone except an amateur radio operator. And I'm not sure about the list because most of them are allowed. But as you can imagine, there's some countries where it's a lot tighter control, and they don't want you to talk to anybody. Okay, definition of what is meant by the term third-party communications: a message from a control operator to another amateur station control operator on behalf of another person. And that is often used if you're, for example, in a disaster and you want to pass a message from somebody saying, hey, your Uncle Joe says that everything's okay, and that's considered third-party communications. Okay, what type of amateur radio station simultaneously retransmit the signal of another amateur station on different channel or channels? And that's just a memorization one. A repeater. That is a definition of a repeater. Next one is an FCC rule thing. Who is accountable should a repeater inadvertently retransmit communications that violate the FCC rules? The control operator of the originating station. And this is because repeaters, there's not somebody standing up there on top of the mountain. It's whoever's originating the signal that's responsible, and not the person who's running the repeater. Which of the following is a requirement for the issuance of a club's license grant? A club must have at least 4 members. And so you can get a amateur radio license for a club, but you need to have at least 4 members to do it. So just rules to remember. Okay, operating procedures. These are, most of these are just memorization, and they don't make a lot of sense until you're programming radios. And which of the following is a common repeater frequency offset in the 2-meter band? You just got to remember 600 kilohertz. It doesn't make any sense until you program a radio. They just have to be offset in order for them to work as repeaters. So you're just going to have to remember 2 meters and 600 kilohertz. It's just a number picked because of the way the radio signals operate. Next question is, what is the national calling frequency for FM simplex operations in the 2-meter band? 146.520, and that's just a memorization thing. That's called FM Simplex, the calling frequency, and it is where generally people are recommended to talk if you're trying to find somebody. And also consider if you're in the wilderness and you have an emergency, that's the frequency you're supposed to use. And that's just a convention. Next one, what is a common repeater frequency offset in the 70 centimeter band? Plus or minus 5 megahertz. Again, that's just one to know. There is, there's some math behind it. And that's the convention in the United States. These actually are not necessarily the same in all countries, but in the United States, 600 for 2 and 5 megahertz for 70. And those are just memorize them.
Ben,
yes.
Quick question. So Simplex, I think there's another one called Duplex or something.
Yes.
Maybe we'll get later to understanding Simplex.
Yeah, I can show you that real quick, just so you can understand a little bit better. Let me put up a whiteboard. Okay, so if you imagine you have, if you have a radio, I'm just gonna have a radio here, right here, and here's another radio. Simplex means that you use one frequency to go both directions. Okay, simplex there, right? So that means that this receives and sends at the same, transmits and receives, and transmits and receives on the same frequency. So that means that this guy can't talk while the other person is talking and vice versa. So radio is, it's not like the telephone. You talk and then you listen to the other person. You can't both talk at the same time. So say you have, so in order to talk back and forth, and this is typically in radio, is only done with a repeater. So imagine you have a radio tower over here. This is a really ugly radio tower. And say you want to talk to somebody. It turns out that this uses something called duplex. The reason why is this radio tower has to transmit and receive at the same time. So this is frequency 1. It cannot receive frequency 1 and send frequency 1 at the same time. It has to send it on a different frequency. And that's because, you can't listen and talk at the same time. So that's called duplex. So when this guy wants to talk to this guy, he transmits on a different frequency as this guy than this guy. And that is duplex. And so this guy, if he wants to talk, he doesn't transmit on frequency 1 or frequency 2. He transmits on frequency 1, and this thing sends it again at frequency 2. So that's a duplex. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, could so in the duplex setup, could both be talking at the same time theoretically, and you could both hear each other as opposed to the simplex kind of garbled?
Not really, not with the radios, but yeah, that's the general idea with if you were to do duplex communications, if you had a radio that could do both 2 frequencies, you could possibly do that, but it's generally used in repeaters.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, let me go back to the other side there. Okay, so what is the appropriate way to call another station on a repeater if you know the other station's call sign? Say the station's call sign, then identify with your call sign. So example here is James here is a licensed operator. If I were to call him, I would say KJ7ARR. This is AI6YR. And that would be how you generally do that on a repeater. That's just a convention. And so that you know what that is. So you just have to remember that. Stay the station's call sign, then identify with the call sign. How should you respond to a station calling CQ? Now, CQ is the way that amateur radio operators look for any contact. And so you can get on amateur radio, you can get on frequencies, and you don't know who's out there. And you'll talk to anybody, which is kind of unique about amateur radio. So if I go onto high frequency right now, there may be people across the country that I don't know who they are, and I'll call CQ. And that is, and what you do is if someone does that, you will call back. You'll transmit the other station's call sign followed by your call sign. And it is all operational stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense till you do it. But that is how that works. I'll skip over here and come back. But what is the meaning of the procedural signal CQ? Is calling any station. And so just so you guys have an idea of it, you actually will go on the high frequency radio and you'll hear people going CQ, CQ, CQ. This is Alpha India 6 Yankee Romeo. And that means basically I'll talk to anybody. And that's what CQ means. Okay, which of the following is required when making on-the-air test transmissions? Identify the transmitting station. And so this is just anytime you transmit, you have to identify. And this is even on a test. So for example, if I'm testing a radio, I'll go test, 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 and I have to transmit my call sign, AI6YR. This is just so they know what's going on. So, okay, what is meant by repeater offset? There's a lot of technical stuff behind this, having to do with all of that repeater stuff. And that's the difference between a repeater's transmit frequency and its receive frequency. And you guys don't need to know any of the details of that for the test. However, this is how a repeater can send and receive. It turns out that if a frequency of transmit and receive are too close, then it'll interfere with itself. And so the repeater offset is the difference between those two that actually works. And there's a lot of math depending on the frequency and all that, but it's just a term that definition you need to know. Okay, I'm going to finish this this page, and then I'll open up for any questions. What brief statement indicates that you're listening on a repeater and looking for contact? Is your call sign. And so if you get on a repeater and you want to see if anyone's out there, all you have to do is go, for me, it's my call sign, AI6YR. And if someone's out there, they might actually come back. In fact, let me see if the local amateur radio guys are on here. I have a radio here, and I will demonstrate it. So I got a radio, which you guys can't see, but if I want to see if anyone's on my local repeater, then I do have a camera. Here, I'll do this. Just a second here. Figure out how to turn it on. Okay, I got to stop the share. So this is a radio, and if I want to see if anyone's out there, I'll go AI6YR, and we'll see if anyone's out there. Apparently no one's out there. So anyway, that's how you do that. Okay.
AI6YR, W6KME.
Oh, actually, someone is listening. W6KME, this is AI6YR. Hey, I'm running an amateur radio class, and I just wanted to demonstrate getting on a repeater. So, how you doing?
Anything you need to let me know. Otherwise, hey folks, this is what a repeater does. Whiskey 6 Kilo Mike Echo, clear.
Thanks a lot, Keith. Talk to you later. AI6YR, I'm clear. Okay, so there you go. That is what a repeater is. Let me turn that off so I don't get interfered. Okay. Last question on this page is, what is a band plan beyond the privileges established by the FCC? And it's a voluntary guideline for using different modes or activities within an amateur band. And so, actually, let me make sure I'm go back to sharing this. Yep, so that's the last question here. And basically, there's something called the band plan that amateur radio operators have come up with. And depending on where they are, it's a completely voluntary thing. So, there are definitely things people want to do. So let me see if I can show you one. just a second here. And I will show you one for, okay, let me share this other window. Okay, can everyone see this band plan here?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, so this is a voluntary band plan for this particular band, which is a 70 centimeter band. And these are just what people have agreed to do. And so these are all voluntary, and someone comes up with it in their area, and everyone agrees, and that's what it looks like. So that is a band plan. So, okay, so that's it for the for what I'm going to cover tonight. Any questions about all this stuff? And I'm hoping that going over these, it makes a little bit more sense rather than just blindly, memorizing the answers to questions. And that's why I'm doing it. So, hopefully it makes a little bit more sense. You can get the license without having any understanding of what the things, what these questions mean. But I think it's usually useful to at least have an idea. That said, even if you understand what they all mean, but you don't remember the right answer, you're not going to pass the test. So, if you're going to choose between understanding exactly what it means and just knowing what the right answer is, know what the right answer is.
Ben.
Yes.
Couple things. One, I'm really liking this whole thing more than I was expecting. So, how hard is it to go from technician to, how hard is it to get to the next level, general, and what would I have to do to be ready for that test?
Yeah, you actually, a lot of people are able to do both the technician and the general at the same time. And there's a new set of questions and a few more math things that you've got to figure out for the general. If you got the book, or if you look at the question pool, it's just a little bit more technical stuff that you've got to memorize. But I have to say that there's an amateur radar operator down the street from me who is 11 years old, and he's passed all 3 tests, and he's 11. So if you look through the material and memorize the questions and understand what they do, you can definitely get it. So I suggest, given that the weird testing criteria, if you're into it, go ahead and study those other ones, because by the time the testing's figured out, you might be able to do all of those.
So in addition to that, when you do take your test, when you guys pass the technician test, you will be offered a chance to take the general test absolutely free. Go ahead and take it. The worst that's going to happen is the next time you're going to need to study and take the test again. But you might actually pass it. When I went for my amateur technician, it was a month later, I went and did my general. It was a lot easier than I expected it to be. And, I walked out basically within a month, had both tech and general.
Yeah, so and it's not unheard of, especially nowadays with folks having time. You probably can. Now, there's a question about remote examinations outside of Alaska. So the Alaska folks will do remote examinations anywhere in the country right now. And so just the hard part there is you do have to have an on-site proctor, and they're probably 30 days out on that. You can probably find folks. Now, of course, you got to figure out how to do that safely and all that. But you just need a computer and somebody to make sure you're not cheating, is what the Alaska requirement is. And they've got to slot you in. So that is that. There's another group, which I believe is in Texas or Nevada, that just did a fully remote test, and they are ramping up. So that's a possibility as well. And I've got the contact info for them. That said, there's a lot of other local groups that would love to do this, and they are they are thinking about also doing similar things. There's some debate within the amateurs I've talked to whether or not they're going to go through all the pain to do this, or if they're just going to wait for things to clear up. I am suspecting personally that people are going to have to figure out how to do remote exams just because of the physical distancing issues. I'm guessing, just given my my following of this, that they're going to be doing this for a while. Even if people are up and about and around, they're going to still say, hey, you know, we don't want to have you in giant groups of 20 people in a room. So I think we're going to have to figure that out. So anyway, the short answer is Alaska will do it if you can get an amateur to show up. And this may be, you know, I imagine you could have a computer set up on a porch, and you know, if you were nearby, I could stand with an N95 and a mask and whatever 20 feet away and just make sure you're not cheating. You know, that's all that's required. So we'll see how that works out. And then again, the Nevada guys say they're doing this completely remotely. There are 3 or 4 amateur radar operators I know who've told me that this used to be pretty common in the whenever they were deployed in the military. And so it's not unheard of to do exams remotely. In those cases, they would actually get sent a exam, and someone would just swear that they didn't cheat on it. In this case, you know, I was talking to one of the amateurs here who did it in the Navy, and his commanding officer just said, okay, here, these guys send me the test, go do the test. And he said, they told me you got, you know, make sure you're not cheating, and I get to sign that no, you didn't cheat. And so it's not like it's never done before. Okay, any other questions? Good. Okay. Well, I'm going to again plan to do this Mondays and Wednesdays until we're done with these questions. I think we're actually we'll probably finish in 1 or 2 sessions here. Not too much more left, and hopefully it'll be helpful. Okay. Thanks everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting now.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.